Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel, Macromodi Languages. This is Joe, and today I would like to talk about one thing that really trips me up a lot when I'm trying to study Portuguese. I've been learning Brazilian Portuguese now for a few years, and one thing that always gets me, because I've been speaking Spanish for most of my life, is the difference between vocabulary words in Spanish and Portuguese. So today I have a video talking about differences between 5 Portuguese and Spanish vocabulary words. So two words that are pretty different in Spanish and Portuguese are the words we have in Portuguese, jantar, and then we have in Spanish, cenar. So those two words both mean in English to have dinner. And let's talk about how those words come from different sources and how they've evolved to have their separate meanings, because Spanish and Portuguese really do come from a very similar source, but you do have these kinds of words that come from very different places like this. So this Portuguese word, jantar, it comes from the Latin word jantare, which means to have breakfast. And that word itself, it comes from the meaning for to break one's fast, this jantare. And we can see that in English the root is much the same, that to break fast is to have breakfast. It means to have dinner now in modern Portuguese, but these kinds of words for different meals of the day, they're very changeable, not just in Romance languages, but in pretty much every language. Because, you know, the concept of when to have meals and how big the meal should be, it's something that's very changeable. It's something that's kind of created and dictated by human society, so it's not like something that's kind of immutable. In Spanish, we have the antiquated food jantar, which also means to lunch, or it also means to dine or eat. But that word is not used anymore, and if you said it, it would probably sound pretty strange. In Spanish, the word cenar, it comes from the Latin word ceno, which means to dine. And we can notice with a lot of languages, these words that refer to meals of the day, they tend to be a little bit not very uniform, because meals of a day are kind of a human-created concept. And so it's the same thing in English when you ask somebody about supper and dinner and what's the difference between supper and dinner. These are terms for meals of a day where the size of the meal and the time of the meal, it's changed a lot in the past centuries based on, you know, class, working schedules, the kind of, you know, industrialization of society. If we compare this to other Romance language words, in Italian the verb for to have dinner is cenare, which also comes from the Latin word ceno. In Romanian, we have the word cina, which means to have dinner as well. In French, I also have the word cene, but the word cene comes from the Latin cenare, and it has a more narrow meaning. It doesn't mean to have dinner, but it means to take kind of like a large meal, usually one like associated with a religious kind of festival. It's kind of like a feast. But then for the verb, we have dîner, which is where we get the English word to dine from. And funnily enough, that word dîner, it comes from the same root as desjejuar. It comes from the same root as desayunar. It comes from the same root of breaking one's fast. So we can see how these kinds of words often kind of go in circles, and languages borrow from one another and kind of change meanings a little bit. So both the verb dîner and the déjeuner, they come from the same word in Latin, which means to break one's fast. So if those are the words for dinner in Spanish and Portuguese, and they come from the word for to break your fast in Latin, then what are the modern words for breakfast in Spanish and Portuguese? Well, the modern word for to have breakfast in Spanish is desayunar, which means, again, to break your fast. We can see that desayunar, ayunar means to fast, and des means to undo something. In Portuguese, we have a word that is very old, very antiquated, and you don't really hear anymore, which is desjejuar, which also means to break your fast. But in Brazil, the word for breakfast is café da manhã, so we say tomar café da manhã. And then in Portugal, the word is pequeno almoço, which comes from the same place that petit déjeuner comes from in French. So it's a kind of like small breaking of your fast. And it should be noted that even though it comes from a translation of petit déjeuner in French, nobody in French really says that in modern day language. They usually just say déjeuner, because petit déjeuner just sounds a little bit like too wordy by modern French standards. Another word that's pretty different between Spanish and Portuguese is the word for hairdresser. In Portuguese, I have the word cabeleireiro, and then in Spanish, I have the word peluquero. So the root of those two words is different in that the Portuguese word cabeleireiro, it comes from the word cabelo, which means hair on one's head. The Spanish word peluquero, it comes from the word for a wig, which is peluca. And that word itself, peluca, it comes from French, which is perruque. And then that word comes from Italian, parrucca. So we have this funny situation where the word for hairdresser in Spanish actually refers to someone in the olden days who would have taken care of a wig. And then the cabeleireiro, Portuguese version, is a little bit more true to life because it refers to someone who would have taken care of actual hair. Word number 3 is the word for window. The word for window in Portuguese is janela, and the word for window in Spanish is ventana. So those two words, they come from very different sources. So the Spanish word ventana, it comes from the word for wind, which in Spanish is viento, or in Latin is ventus. And we can see how, again, in English, the word window, it has, the same root more or less where it comes from wind. The word janela in Portuguese is pretty interesting. It comes from the word for a little opening. In Latin, I have the word janua, which means opening, and it actually comes from the word for the Roman god of doorways, who was Janus. But there are also a lot of other words between Spanish and Portuguese that are in existence, but they're either obsolete or they're just not used very often. The original Latin word for window was fenestra, and we can see in Portuguese and Spanish we have words that come from this that are all pretty antique, pretty antiquated. In Spanish, we have the words finiestra, we have iniestra, and fenestra. Finiestra and iniestra are words that evolved from Latin naturally, but they've kind of fallen out of use. And fenestra is a word which is borrowed from Latin at a later point in time. In Portuguese, we have the word fenestra, and we also have the word fresta, which is a word that means kind of like a space between something, or a slit in something, or a small kind of thin window. And we also have in Portuguese the word ventana, which obviously comes from the same place as the Spanish word ventana, but that word is hardly ever used. When I asked my friends from Portugal and Brazil about it, they actually did not ever even hear this word before in their life. If we compare this to other Romance languages, we can see that both Spanish and Portuguese are kind of outliers, because the words for window in other Romance languages, in French, Italian, and Romanian, they actually come from the original Latin word fenestra. So then, in Italian, I have the word finestra, which is more or less the same as Latin, besides a kind of vowel change. In French, I have the word fenêtre. And in Romanian, I have the word fereastră. So those words are all pretty similar to Latin, but Spanish and Portuguese went their own way with it, and we can see that the results are kind of different. And that's something that happens a lot with languages, right? When you have languages that make a new, innovative word for something, those are words that tend to be different because the languages will come up with new ways of innovating a different word. Word number 4 is the word for to look at something. To look at something in Spanish is mirar, and to look at something in Portuguese is olhar. We can see that in Portuguese, the word mirar means to aim at something. And if we compare this to other Romance languages, we can see that there are things that are also innovated when it comes to the word to look. The Spanish word comes from mirare, which is in Latin to look at or regard something. In Old French, we have the word mirer, but then the modern word in French is regarder, which we can see how we get the English word regard from that. The Portuguese word olhar, it obviously comes from the word olho, which means your eye. So when you look at something, you use your eyes. So we can see this is another kind of innovated word in Portuguese that is not really used so much in Spanish. And the last word we have in Spanish and Portuguese is the word for dog. The word for dog in Spanish is perro, and the word for dog in Brazilian Portuguese is cachorro, and the word for dog in Portuguese and Portugal is cão. So that word cão, it's still used in Brazil in some contexts, like guard dog, and obviously there are words that come from it, like canil. But cachorro is the more normal word to use in Brazil. In Portugal, the word cachorro, it's usually used to mean a puppy or a little dog. It can also mean hot dog as well, cachorro quente, or cachorro quente, I suppose it would be in Portuguese accent. The word cachorro exists in Spanish as well, but again, it means puppy only. The word perro in Spanish, nobody really knows where it's from, per se. But there was the old word in Spanish, can, which obviously came from the Latin word cane, which means dog. But that was replaced by the word perro. They innovated a new word in the Spanish language that doesn't exist anymore. It's not used, can, anymore. The word cachorro, or cachorro, it comes from the Basque word, actually, which Basque is the language, a non-Indo-European language spoken in Spanish that predates the arrival of Romance languages. And that word means puppy in Basque, so it means puppy in Spanish as well, and it's come to mean dog in Brazilian Portuguese. So I hope you found this video about the comparison between Spanish and Portuguese vocabulary words interesting and where they came from. And for more videos like this, subscribe to my channel Mapa Mundi Languages to see new material being released every Friday.